So this is the second lesson just on helping you as adult Sunday school teachers and lay leaders in your personal study. I hope it's a help. This particular lesson, as you see, is going to deal with genre. There are various kinds of genre in the Bible. It's important that as you begin to study a passage, you either know what the genre is and or you find out what the genre is. And this lesson is going to talk about that. And so when we talk about genre, we're talking about types of literature, and there are again various forms in the scriptures. So a few things we're going to try and cover is finding the ordinary meaning of the passage. That's obviously something we dealt with a little bit in the principalizing bridge. I will cover a little bit more in the future, and part of this as well. Find the language type, and that's what we're dealing with, or the literature type in this particular lesson. And then as the lessons progress, we'll learn to find the single meaning of each passage. So a few quotes from McQuilkin, one of the books that I had sourced earlier, is this kind of analysis attempts to answer such questions as the date and author of a book and the genre or type of literature in any passage. Such study is not inherently rationalistic. Knowing the difference between a law and a proverb or poetry in an epistle is helpful in properly understanding the author's meaning. And so, just simply put, you cannot approach a poetical book in the same way that you would approach a narrative portion of Scripture in terms of interpretation. This leads to chopping off paragraphs in the middle. This leads to cross-referencing that is not healthy and does not stay true to the meaning of a passage. Again, McQuilkin says, as in all human communication, one begins with the assumption that the speaker or writer is saying something to be taken in its literal meaning, and that's how we interpret here, is beginning with the grammatical, historical, and literal interpretation. Therefore, literal language must be interpreted literally. Figurative language, figuratively, and poetic language, poetically. Did Jerusalem and Judea literally go out to hear John the Baptist? Okay, so in Matthew 3:5. That is, did the physical city move out into the wilderness? For example, Jesus said concerning the bread, "This is my body." That expression is taken as literal by more than half of those who call themselves Christians, and I think you know what he's alluding to with that quote, being that the Catholics believe in transubstantiation. So, that being said, a couple examples here where we would typically begin with the literal, but the obvious meaning of the passage would cause us to understand that there's either metaphorical language. Okay, but if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age and needs so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not. Let them marry. And notice the phrase, the flower of her age, or even some of the English language itself, the beauty and the words that are used that maybe we don't use today as they're preserved here in our Bible. So there are going to be some things that you certainly want to take literally, and then some things that you don't take literally, but you always begin with literal interpretation unless otherwise the text either implicitly or quite explicitly tells you not to. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then said Jesus unto him, that thou doest do quickly. And we'll look at a few others of these types of things. There's other, when we look at the poetry, you'll see where the Bible talks about the Lord having eyes, and it's talking about God or Jehovah, but then John chapter 4 says that God is a spirit, or it talks about God riding on the winds, on the wings of the wind. So there are different things the Scripture uses. Some are called anthropomorphisms, where they attribute to God man-like characteristics. As we look at poetic language, where that's mainly used, we'll look at that, but that's just one type of genre. Again, you want to pay attention to details within every passage to see if there's metaphorical language, but we always begin with a literal unless the scripture either explicitly or implicitly teaches us otherwise. So, genre. What form is the passage written in? What are my options? How do I scripturally determine literary genre? And what are some basic truths about context? So, what form is the passage in? One of the things you want to do is note the boundaries of the text. There's a couple ways you can do this. The boundaries of the text are not always evident in like a Scofield Bible. As a matter of fact, the verses and chapter headings were not originally in the inspired manuscripts like we have them today. And of course, you know that the chapters sometimes break up the thought. But it may be wise to invest in a paragraph study Bible or to have a good commentary that breaks up the scriptures by paragraph. So there are several commentaries. You have Expositor's commentary or the Pillar's New Testament commentary set. Those are a couple that may be of help. Again, Cambridge has a paragraph Bible that may be of help as well. A question you also want to ask is it a narrative text? When we say narrative, we're talking about is there like a story with a setting and main characters that leads to tension, and then the tension breaks because of some kind of resolution that's brought. So if you're reading the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis 37, that would be a narrative text. And then the other question you want to ask is once you've identified what type of text it is, if it's a narrative, and you've somewhat identified the barriers or the boundaries of the text, how many chapters does it span? Again, back to the example of Joseph, that one spans multiple chapters throughout the remaining, pretty much the entire back half of Genesis is dealing with the life of Joseph in some form or fashion. And then what are the divisions within the narrative? And this, again, this particular lesson is just a brief overview of the genre, but when we're talking about the narrative or the divisions of the narrative, you're looking for setting, you're looking for what is the tension, what is the climax of the setting, what causes the break of the tension, and what's the new way of living moving forward, who are the main characters, that type of thing, which I'll deal with when we get to a more detailed study of narrative portions of Scripture. So you have a few options. When you're looking at Scripture, there are several options for genre. In the Old Testament, you have narrative literature, you have law, you have poetry, you have prophecy, and you have wisdom literature. Of course, you can immediately identify some overlap here. For example, in the poetry books, you have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Now, there is poetry outside of the poetical books. So when you're looking for a genre, you may be in the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses is singing, and you identify poetry, or Miriam's song. So there's poetry, and there is overlap within the different genres, just like there's wisdom within different genres of the Old Testament. But this is just kind of a quick overview of the Old Testament types of genres, which you would probably run into in most cases. In the New Testament, you have the gospel literature, you have history, which is largely the book of Acts, but there's other books that contain history. For example, in the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul, at the end of chapter 1, gives his salvation testimony. You have a letter, or the epistles, that Paul wrote. The apocalyptic literature, I think, is pretty clear, the book of Revelation being the most obvious one. But you also have things like passages like Matthew 24 and 25, or 1 Thessalonians 4, going all the way into chapter 5, that deals with things to come. And then both Old and New Testament also has sub-genres. Within those genres are things, for example, in the Gospels you have parables. You also have riddles. An example of that would be when Samson, with his first wife, he offered a riddle to his enemies, and his wife gave away the riddle. Long story short, that's riddle there. You see other riddles within the Old Testament literature as well. these would be considered subgenres. And then you have sermons. So in the book of Acts, though the book of Acts is largely historical and it's largely narrative, you also have sermons. So when you get to Acts chapter 7, you have a man by the name of Stephen who gives a sermon. And so that's going to guide how you view the passage overall. I realize this may not make a lot of difference for you as you think about all this, but if I could just give you an example, and then I'll close this off for today, and I'll pick up on another session, is in the poetry, especially poetry, the Bible and that literature uses a lot of parallelism. And so the danger in not understanding the genre that you're working in, so if you're reading a poetic portion in the book of Genesis, well, the danger is that you might read the first line and not realize that there's a parallelism, and then you'll read the second line, and what you'll do is you'll build some kind of a compounding truth rather than understanding that the parallelism is there to further affirm the same truth. And so it is important that you understand the type of genre you're working with. Same thing with prophecy. There are different elements of prophecy, and you have to be really careful because there will be times where you'll see things immediately being fulfilled, and then things that are meant to be fulfilled in the future. But if you're treating the prophetical portion of Scripture ignorant of the fact that it's prophecy, you may not even realize, and you may have a hard time finding out what the author's really pointing to and what he's talking about. So those are just a few thoughts there. The narrative, trying to understand the meaning within the narrative passage. Again, you have that setting, you have the main characters, you have the climactic point of the story, and then you have the breaking point, and then the new way of living. For example, if you're reading the book of Ruth, in the opening chapter, you have the setting and the main characters right away. You have Elimelech, you have them leaving Bethlehem, you have them settling down in Moab. You have them, the two young men dying, but you get to a climactic point where Ruth and Orpah have to make a decision, and Ruth obviously decides to stay with Naomi, and again, and then there's a new way of living. It's Naomi and Ruth moving forward, and so that segment of the Scripture needs to be interpreted in light of how the narrative has been written, understanding the setting, the characters, the climax, what's the new way of living. And then when I get to application, I'll talk about how do you apply this response that you see, this new way of living now after the climax and the tension is broken because of a decision that's been made. And then, of course, there's a Christological application, which I'll talk about. And then we want to make a contextual application to our time today as we cross the bridge. Okay? So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight, just an overview on genres in the Scripture.